So Dan, listen, you discovered that you had ADHD as an adult. How did that sort of present itself to you? How did it, give us an example really of how it affected you when you were diagnosed?
So I was diagnosed at a stage which is quite common in adulthood. I think the two main reasons people get diagnosed in adulthood is either that their children have just been diagnosed and they suddenly think, I see a lot of these things that, have been going through about my child, actually that sounds a lot like me as well. I hadn't, that wasn't what happened with me. I had very young children at that stage. For me, it was the wheels were just falling off. They were, at home. I just had a second child. I had one very young baby, a toddler. And I just wasn't operating how I expected myself to be. It was very difficult for me to focus, on childcare and work and balance everything else. As I say, that it really felt like the wheels were coming off, and I was in a bit of a crisis point. And thankfully, my wife, who her mum used to sort of teach SEN children and work with them a lot. She knew all the signs, and she kind of steered me gently towards a diagnostic test online, and it was just sort of a light bulb moment. I knew straight away, and I booked an appointment with the GP the next day, and it went from there. I got the diagnosis, and it was a real moment of clarity. I could look back on so many things in my life and suddenly think, actually that now makes sense. And at work, things started to improve quite quickly. Because I had the understanding of why things might have been going wrong, and also medication helps a great deal. It's and unlike autism, for example, ADHD responds very well to medication. So with medication, with understanding, I could build from there, and I was suddenly able to do things I never, ever thought I would be able to do. I had been working on new summaries. They were hourly or half hourly, short, very deadline focused, which was great because it kept me on track. But suddenly I found I was able to do longer term projects, planning things, stuff I just hadn't ever considered that I'd be able to do, just because it felt so, how I'd look at other people doing these long-term projects and think, how on earth do they keep all this and, all this going? And I went on and did a sort of a 2-year deep dive, which became a podcast called Paradise. It's had millions of downloads. It's won awards and all these kinds of stuff. And I just, I look back from that point and think, back to that crisis point when I got the diagnosis. And I just cannot imagine, that's the turn I would take. I'd be doing these big projects that, take organising and produce results. It was extraordinary transformation.
Angela, one of your businesses, Neve Learning, it focuses on training. Can you explain how a neurodiverse person may learn differently to a neurotypical person?
So, how this all came about was we were responding to a Scottish Government challenge to look at how to improve online learning, really, how to make immersive online learning. So we'd all gone COVID and were suddenly doing 9-hour Zoom calls for training, and that wasn't really working for anybody. At the same time, I was trying to obtain an ADHD diagnosis for my son. And when we were doing our user research to solve this problem for the government, we discovered actually what people were telling us is that what we had right now wasn't working for people anyway, and everybody learned differently. So yes, some people were coming to us and saying, I'm dyslexic, therefore I have troubles retaining information if you're speaking at me for any longer than 20 minutes. Some people were saying, I feel really socially anxious in group settings. Some people were saying, traditional learning's never really worked for me. I've forged my own path. Some people were saying they had a diagnosis and this was why, but for many people, it was just they made their own pathways. They'd found their own workarounds to school, to learning, to workplace learning. So there's so many different permutations of how a person might learn differently. It's again back to that point that all of our brains work differently, but there's specific things that we can say, right, well, this is more likely in a dyslexic person. Dyslexic people tend to be very visual. They connect ideas a lot, so giving them screeds of written text can be quite a challenge, particularly if they do have Mearns-Erlin, which is about the colour contrast on the page, which I myself have, although I'm not dyslexic. So chunking information up is really quite important from a neurodiverse friendly perspective. Changing formats, offering multiple formats, giving different sort of accessibility features is really important. But what we found is there were some universal principles that just made for better learning for everybody. Be really clear in what it is that you're trying to teach. Break things down, give things people in multiple formats, and then personalize for them. For some people, like a deadline, that is the best thing they could have. Other people need all of the information up front, and they want to go through absolutely everything, and they will show up to the first class having read the whole thing. So making things better from a neurodivergent perspective makes it better for everyone anyway, because we all learn better like that. So understanding, I think, particularly the working memory aspect. So there's different parts of your memory. I've been on a journey. The working memory, typically in someone with dyspraxia, ADHD, or dyslexia, tends to be shorter. So you don't retain the information for doing short tasks as quickly, or, a short conversation. You might like, a squirrel, over here, and you've not retained that. And often with dyslexia, it's like you'll read the first few lines and then you've forgotten it already. So my husband, that's the challenge that he has. He can read each word. He has no problem with that. By the time he gets to the end of the sentence, he's forgot what was at the beginning of the sentence. So there's a working memory challenge. However, there's many different kinds of memory that your brain has. For example, episodic memory, which is your memory for events and situations, where in someone with dyspraxia or autism, that tends to be like a super skill and a superpower. And my team often refer to me as the trap, because I just like, if I'm in a meeting, I basically can verbatim tell you everything that happened there. And they'll try and say that, and I was like, I know that happened. Like, don't even argue with me. I know what happened, because that's how my brain retains information. However, I can drive to the same place 17 times, and the 18th time I will completely forget the directions. And that has happened to me, and I've had to pull over and get the sat-nav out for somewhere that I've had to drive to several times. So memory is an interesting one. So tailoring to the fact that working memory could be a challenge for someone as a base is a good place to start, right?